We are just getting people registered or into the group here. Excited to have you back for our third series here on our more than modular modern methods of construction for non-market housing. So as we get people admitted into the room, we're just going to go through some of the stuff we've been going through every other week. So again, thank you for joining us. This is our third session here. And today we are going to be looking at designing with intention, which I'm very excited about. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Again, if you'd like to add into the chat where you're joining us from, any of your own land acknowledgements. I'm joining again from very, very snowy, complete turnaround from last Tuesday, what's colonially known as Edmonton here in Miskatchewa-Skyken, where we're under a snowfall warning, which is always fun to have. But I keep reminding myself that it's February and it's normal, so I just gotta keep with it. Just a reminder again as well that we are pleased to have interpretation services through Wordly AI platform. If you are switching between languages, please just give it a moment to register which language you're working on, because it might sometimes take a moment or two to switch between languages. But all you need to do is scan the QR code, which will also be in the chat, and you can access that interpretation throughout the session. And also just want to thank again the partners who are here today for being here. So we've got Paige Woldog from CADCO. We've got Brandon Searle from the UNB offsite construction team. And then once again, this program is also in collaboration with the Chartered Institute of Housing Canada, as well as the Canadian Housing and Real Association. And as always, I must plug our Congress coming up soon here in St. John's, Newfoundland. I'm very excited myself to go to Newfoundland for the first time. If you happen to fly in early, April 18th is my birthday in true Aries fashion. I will be celebrating. You're all welcome to join me there. Just let me know you're wanting to come. And as well, I wanted to just plug briefly that we do have 2 Chartered Institute of Housing cohorts running this spring. One is a certificate in housing services for new managers or new people to the housing sector, people who are just kind of getting started in their property management careers, as well as we have our experienced professional route starting this spring, which is our chartered membership, and that is for people who are more experienced in the sector, who are wanting to showcase that they already have the knowledge and what it takes to have a professionalization standard within the housing sector. So thank you once again for being here. Thank you for joining us, and I want to pass it over to Paige as I stop sharing.
Hello, everyone. Thank you once again for having me. We are excited to join you all for our third day of the More Than Modular course. So last week, we talked about procurement and how that works with different professionals and why an MMC integrator is very helpful, the different kind of teams and how you can set them up. We talked about the common MMC technologies from volumetric, panelization, mass timber, and then we had a Q&A with 2 guest speakers, one from Aliston and one from Maison Bonneville. And then we ended with a really wonderful case study provided by Util. This week, we're going to be talking about design considerations. So when you're talking about your project, what are some of the things that you want to think about as you're building out your project concept for the design of your project? We're going to talk a little bit about the municipal review process, mostly in the context of some ways that it might change along the way if you're considering using more than modular construction, or sorry, not more than modular, modern methods of construction in your project. we're going to talk about, Branda's going to talk about site impacts of MMC. So if you're using a modern method of construction, what are some of the considerations you have to have as it relates to the site and the restrictions that your site might impose? We'll talk about CSA A277 certification, which is an important certification as it relates to a lot of the different manufacturers for different modular components. And then we're going to finish it off with a Q&A with Craig Mitchell, who will be joining us from 720 Modular. So Craig Mitchell is joining us today. He's a partner working on project development for 720 Modular. And one of the first things I'll have Craig do when we turn the presentation over to him is introduce himself and a little bit about himself. Just a reminder for everyone, this is supposed to be our Q&A with an expert section. So if you have any questions, I encourage you to start thinking about those ahead of time. And you can put them in the chat, and Brandon and I will moderate the discussion. So when you're thinking about designing your thinking about your project, one of the first things you're going to want to do is think about all of the different factors that might impact what your project will look like, what your concept that you're going to create is. And one of those first ones is going to be your project vision, particularly if we're thinking about creating a project that meets a specific need or population type. You're going to really want to think about that project vision and what are some of the unique features that your project will need in order to serve that mission. Identifying your project vision early on will also help give you direction as the project keeps going, so you know what path forward you want to take when you come to certain decision points. The second thing you're going to want to look into and think about is the planning requirements and the site requirements of your project. So looking about the size of your project, the scale, will that actually be able to fit on the site that you're looking for? Is it planned appropriately? What restrictions does your zoning give you for your project? And again, making sure that you have a full understanding of what those restrictions are, so they are able to better understand of what it is that you're actually able to make. If you want to, it's at this point that you could bring in a planner to help give a planning perspective of your site and what actually might be able to be built there, as well as if you need to make any rezoning or changes to your zoning with your municipality, what might be feasible. One other thing you might want to consider is also the community need, making sure that the project that you're building actually fits the need of your community. Once again, if you're building something, for instance, if you want to build a building that's absolutely full of student housing, but there is no university or secondary education in your community, that might not be a good fit. So you want to make sure that what you're building actually meets the need of the community that you're serving. Other things you're going to want to continue at this think about at this early stage is your construction technology. If you're planning to use traditional construction techniques at this point in time, you don't need to think about it too much. But if you're planning on using one of those modern methods of construction, identifying that earlier rather than later makes things a lot easier. Brandon was talking about this last week and the importance of the role of that MMC integrator in your project so that you can better understand the implications of those decisions. It's easier to make that decision now and switch into a traditional route as opposed to the other way around. And finally, some other things you might want to think about in this early stage of your project are any funding requirements. Again, particularly if you're thinking of doing affordable housing or supportive housing, if you're looking for specific funding for that project, make sure that your project meets any of the requirements that funding has. Thinking historically, CMHC would have had specific targets around energy efficiency, around accessibility, around affordability. BCH right now is definitely focused on modern methods of construction, as well as different affordability metrics. But you might be trying to get funding from your municipality or from your province. You might be trying to get funding from a foundation. If you're looking for if you're providing supportive housing, you might have some operational requirements requirements that you want to consider ahead of time, and make sure that those targets are included in your project concept and vision. One thing that I'll touch on a little bit more in detail is those planning and those site requirements. So again, making sure that you take a look at that zoning bylaw or the zoning of your area, understanding any of the lot constraints. How big is your site? What will you actually be able to build on it? What are your neighbors and surrounding areas? What do they look like? Figure out what area on your site you're actually able to build on. Just because it's part of your site doesn't mean that you're actually able to build on that portion of your site. You could have setbacks or some geological features that make building on certain areas unrealistic. And then you're also, again, if you're thinking about that modern methods of construction, you're also going to think about some of your staging requirements. So if you need to bring in a crane in order to to put in the modules, you might want to consider that at this point in time. If you're on a really, really small inner city site where it's really dense, that might prove difficult depending on the site requirements, especially if you need to get a road closure permit from the city at some point, and they might not be willing to give that to you. So make sure you think about how you're going to stage the project as well. This is for any type of project, but very specifically for supportive housing or affordable housing, you're also going to want to think about your amenities and the services that you're provided. Are there any features that you'll need to add specifically for the project that you're planning, that vision that you set out? So think about, what type of lobby do you need? Do you need extra space? What are your parking requirements? What's your outside seating area looking like? Garbage rooms, especially if you plan to have a lot of accessibility considerations in your project, making sure that you have enough room in your garbage room for turning radiuses, but also the modified garbage bins so that people can access them. Laundry room, are you doing in-suite laundry? Are you doing external laundry? Are you planning a garden? Are you planning other creative pursuits for your tenants? Do you need elevators? One of the big things that we keep hearing about is that a lot of groups will pretty much never move forward anymore unless they're able to put in 2 elevators. So having one closed down during operations, again, particularly for buildings where accessibility requirements are of a high priority, having only 1 elevator causes a lot of friction and difficulties down the road during operations if it ever needs to go down for maintenance or repair. And finally, any additional supports. Are you providing additional supports for your tenants that might need a physical space to host those supports? So is there a community room? Are you providing a room where maybe a nurse is able to come in and check in on some of your tenants? Office spaces. Do you need somebody with 24/7 at the building 24/7? Perhaps you make sure that they have a space that's provided to them as well. So these are all kind of just prompts of things that you might want to think about as you're planning your project in the future. Every single project is going to be different, depending on the site that you have, depending on the tenants you're trying to serve, depending on the operational requirements of your area. Each project is going to be a little bit different, but you're going to probably want to think about each of these things independently to make sure that you're at least considering them. So once you go through that process, you should have your design outputs. These are the things that you're aiming for. You should have an understanding of what your building typology is going to be, what type of scale you're going to be looking at. There is a lot of projects aim for biggest and best use, so they try to build as tall as possible, as wide as possible, so that they can get the best use out of that site. I hear from a lot of our supportive clients who provide supportive housing that biggest and best doesn't necessarily always work for them. There's a lot of supportive housing providers who find that around 40 units is pretty much the maximum of what they're able to provide in any one building. And that has a lot to do with the community building efforts that they make for that project and for that building, and making sure that each individual tenant can feel seen and heard in that building. So thinking about scale might also be an element of that project vision. You'll have a better understanding of the unit count and that unit mix, how many bedrooms are going to be in that project. You'll have an understanding of the social outcomes you're trying to achieve, as well as what amenity spaces you need to include. So by going through that kind of checklist, you'll be able to go from those design inputs to those design outputs and have a general sense of what it is that you're going to try to make. And that's usually what goes into your project concept. So once you have that project concept and are able to understand what it is exactly you want to build, one of the things we often recommend if your city doesn't actually demand it already is a pre-consultation with your planning department at your municipality or at your province, depending on where you're located. A lot of smaller municipalities might not have the infrastructure to be able to support a planning application and might bump it up to a provincial responsibility. That happens mostly for much smaller municipalities. So you want to, generally during that pre-consultation process, one of the things you're going to go through is understanding from the city's perspective or the municipality's perspective what that process is going to look like. What applications do you need to put in at what time? Who do you need to get involved in that? They're going to give you what we call a spill or a studies plans information list. Depending again where you are, it may include different site plans and different requirements or studies requirements, but each city should theoretically have an understanding of what's required. So you'll get a list of all the studies that you need to do and all the plans you need to do in order to be able to move forward with your project. It's at this pre-consultation that you're also going to be able to receive any project feedback from the municipality. They might have some commentary around if you're planning to change anything from a planning perspective, go for a rezoning or a minor variance. And I apologize, the language for these changes, province by province and municipality by municipality, they're usually roughly the same thing though. So you might want to change some stuff around your planning requirements, and they can give you some feedback around they think is viable and feasible, and other ones where it might be a little bit more of a battle. And finally, would also be a good opportunity to start that education process if you're planning to use any of the modern methods of construction in your project. Talking to the city, informing them about that you're going to be using these types of technologies and the implications of that for them. This would be a really good opportunity to use an MMC integrator that Brandon was talking about last week to help with that conversation and make sure that they have the information that they need in order to make this process as smooth as possible. So you've done your concept, you've done your pre-consult. It's at this point that you move forward with obtaining all of those studies and plans so that that spill list from the city provides you, or if the municipality provides you. It's also at this time that you'll move forward with any of your rezoning efforts if you need to rezone it all, as well as obtaining or at least understanding what other permits you might require. It's at this point in time that you'll think of very specifically if there's any ramifications or permits that you need because you're using a modular or panelization for your project. You might need to have a staging area for a crane. You might need to close down a road, so you might need a street and services permit or a road closure permit, depending on where you're located. If you need to bring in particularly wide loads, you might need a wide load or an oversized permit in order to bring things onto the site. If you need to infringe on other municipal areas, you might need a temporary construction permit, encroachment permit. There's lots of different permits. Again, each municipality is going to be a bit unique, so you're going to want to work really closely with your project team as well as with your municipality and your representatives there to have a fulsome understanding of what's actually going to be required of you. But just making sure you have that understanding and you bring it up in conversation with them. And finally, at that point, you can go forward with your site plan control if you require site plan control for your project and try to obtain your building permit. I think that's my last slide, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to Brandon at this point.
Thanks, Paige. So, yeah, I always have the slide placeholder, but I think everyone knows me now. When thinking about this this topic, in my world, we often talk about design for manufacturing and assembly. And so that often happens kind of in the in the post planning phase when, well, it should be incorporated there, but really when you're engaging your design team, ideally have an integrator involved and then have that manufacturer involved in design assist. So, last week we talked about procurement types and how to like optimal procurement that allows for that um, design build team to essentially be formed that involves manufacturers to help with design assist, your general contractor, your integrator if you have one, as well as your architects and the design team. And so when we get talking about design with intention, we're often trying to first, understand, okay, what are some manufacturing constraints or assembly constraints, and how do we optimize that? But a lot of things that can often be overlooked are the logistics constraints. So at our research center, we've often started saying DF MLA instead of just DFMA, which is often known for design for manufacturing and assembly. So that's a bit of what I'll be talking about today, and then I'll dive into CSA a little bit before the best part, which is the Q&A with Craig. So just a reminder, the MMC categories that we talked about 2 weeks ago, and these are the ones that Build Canada Homes are often referencing, particularly the top four. When we're talking today, we're really focused more so on the category 1 and 2, particularly when we're talking about CSA standards, but it's really applicable to any anything done off site. So first thing when thinking about on-site logistics and installation is from your shipping side. So uh, Paige alluded to it in the permitting process and the planning process. So you have to think about, oversized routes or oversized loads and getting permits for that. So what are your shipping limits? Are there any height restrictions on your route? Different things like that. Things that get a bit more technical. Is talking about your load stability, which a lot of manufacturers, they've done a lot of this already, or the integrators have been involved in modular projects. So a lot of times they will already know that, but just down the road from me, there was a mini home being relocated, and they missed or it became unstable and they ended up in the ditch. So it can happen. So you gotta plan in advance. But that's the rare occurrence for sure. Delivery route is important, particularly if that involves going to remote areas and understanding some of the constraints along those routes. We've done some work for Newfoundland and Labrador or in that province, and there's certain constraints related to ports and overhead wires and different things like that you need to consider. Your laydown area and on-site storage is particularly key. And one thing we noted there is insurance, which is really something that could be discussed at any stage of the project. But here, the laydown area, there may be some environmental factors that impact, when you're going to be able to crane and install your modules, and that might lead to needing additional laydown area, or maybe it's not as just in time as you had originally hoped for a variety of reasons. So that will be key. And from an insurance side, it's important to consider, okay, when looking at a laydown area, what requirements are needed from the folks insuring it, and who owns them at which point, which really is into what we talked about last week, procurement and contracts. Your turning radius, so on the job site. So that's another factor for consideration, and any environmental impacts as well. So in terms of site layout and planning, again, this can get a little technical, and we have my colleague actually does a course with a full module on cranes and your kind of site layout planning. But really, there's considerations on around crane locations, lifting capacity, and radius. So again, your MMC integrator will often have expertise in that. Sometimes the GCs will, and they'll work collaboratively during that design phase of planning that site coordination. Your load balancing and center of gravity, again, this is something that often manufacturers have already sorted out. They know the rigging details and different things like that, and they already have this sorted out. But it's something that's definitely a consideration. your lifting and installation sequence is obviously key. The coordination between the manufacturer and the on-site team is something that's important. Obviously, the the last one out of the factory is kind of the first one installed in theory. So with panelization, in other instances, you'll have it arrive on site and installed right away, or it go into a temporary laydown area. And then your ground preparation for equipment. So again, that gets into your site or your site planning, where you're going to locate your cranes and some of the requirements around that, which again, the training companies, your integrators, your GCs, the engineer team, etc., should have some expertise in. And then one project there's a couple projects we've been doing for the north, or with companies that are building for the north, I should say. And one of them, as you can see from pictures here, they're transporting modules from Manitoba up to Cambridge Bay. And there was another one we did where we were the idea was that they would transport panels from Quebec to 3 assembly factories in Rankin Inlet, Iqaluit, and Cambridge Bay, and then kind of finish them up there and then go to site for install. Obviously, there's a few more constraints, particularly around your extended supply chain. A short window for shipping construction. Our colleague from Elliston last week talked about that a little bit and planning for that. And essentially, if you miss your opportunity to ship, I think it's like a 9 or 10 months wait time. On-site equipment restrictions, so considerations around that, and how do you bring equipment to the site temporarily. On-site workforce restrictions as well. So, the labor shortage, which I think we've talked about over the last 2 weeks, is evident across the construction industry, but particularly evident in remote locations. Lack of services and infrastructure, designed for logistics impact. So again, like how you are getting those modules off the ship, barging those in, moving those around in this case with a loader, and so on. And then last thing, just around foundation and permafrost impact. So one thing that we've seen are triodetic foundations, and I'm hopefully not putting a plug in for one particular company there, but those tend to be used in some northern climates, and there's some factors there. You often see them sitting up on some type of stilts and not on a typical foundation. So then going into CSA stuff a little bit here, there's kind of a lot of people will say, a CSA certified manufacturer, and a lot of times that specifically alluding to CSA A277, which is procedure for certification of prefab buildings, modules, and panels. But there's also a CSA Z240 and CSA A660. The A660 I don't have as much experience in, excuse me, but it's certification of manufacturers of steel building systems. And then CSA Z240 and A277 are things that I'll touch on here in a sec. The more recent ones that have come in really since 2020 and aren't completely out yet are the CSA Z250, Z251, and Z252. So that's really on like the process for delivery of volumetric modular buildings. So some of that's really like guidance for design teams, the guidance for inspectors, planners, GCs, etc. The design for modular construction Z251, I understand, will be coming out soon. And again, that's more specific to design teams. And then guidance for compliance and approval processes, or we'll have like a checklist, I believe, of what you can go through and check out. So on the inspection certification, so essentially factories will get certified either A277 or Z240, but in most cases both. They'll get their quality program will get certified. So these are both applicable to factory built housing, but serve different purposes and different types. And the certification includes an auditing factory quality program, inspection of prefab products, verifying compliance with applicable codes, and quarterly inspections and reports. So I was in a factory a couple weeks ago, As an example, they'll have their clipboard that's attached to a module and will go along throughout their factory. And at the end of that, in this particular company's case, at the end of that process, they will scan all those quality sheets. So those clipboards contain a checklist for each station of what needs to be approved and to meet the CSA standard. And then those will be digitized, for lack of a better term. At any point over the next, few years, an inspector could arrive and say, we want to see, the report for all the projects you did from this period to that period or whatever it might be. And they could be audited randomly at any time. And so those are particularly important with A277. So a couple differences, and this is one, like this slide has often been presented to building officials because for a long time, a lot of people kind of understood modular construction as mini homes or manufactured homes, and that's kind of governed by Z240, whereas A277 is what a lot of the case study that was presented last week with UTIL or the one prior to that with attainable homes, those modules coming out would have been A277 certified. So scope is modular homes, panels, and modules for A277, where it's mini homes or manufactured homes for Z240. An example of application is modular homes used for permanent housing. The permanent's kind of the key word there. Permanent housing, development, schools, offices, etc. Whereas manufactured homes are for residential living, often in rural areas or mobile home parks. Code compliance. So one thing that comes up a lot is A277 is does it comply with the National Building Code? So yes, it does, and whatever the local code governing in that area is what it complies with. Z240 focused on manufacturing housing systems with reference to the National Building Code. Construction, so A277, they're often built in modules for on-site assembly. Again, like the ones that we saw over the last 2 weeks with case studies, whereas Z240 has fully factory built as complete units and get fully tested. Inspection, we mentioned, is third party for both cases. And the last one is that the transportation chassis. So typically transported as sections and placed on a permanent foundation with A277. Whereas Z240, it's a frame chassis that's either steel or wood that gets used. So really the difference that we try to emphasize here is it's A277, at least maybe Craig will disagree or correct me, but A277 is for permanent modular projects, whereas Z240 is for non-port permanent or relocatable in most cases. So that is a few things worth noting. And again, when you're going through procurement and things like that, ensuring or making sure, I guess, that your manufacturers have these certifications or some type of equivalent is key. It has presented some difficulties with some manufacturers who may be, pretty young in their like almost a startup because the cost is pretty significant. But I would highly recommend, considering if you're going this route to ensure that they have that CSA certification. So my last slide is about next week, so I'll save that for the end. I think we can go into some Q&A now and maybe invite Craig.
Yeah, just before we do, there's just was a quick question for you, Brandon, on would you elaborate a bit more on the potential of using endpoint microfactories as part of the prefabrication chain in the north? And this actually might be a better question for Craig in a minute, but just wanted to flag that came up during your presentation.
Yeah, let me. So I think that was because I referenced the project we did with a company. So their business model. Let me just make sure I'm getting this right. Yeah, so the business model of the company was essentially they were focused on, job creation in the north as well as, building affordable housing. So there were certain constraints, and this isn't the case with everything, but there were certain material and labor constraints and equipment constraints that it just didn't make sense for them to build a full factory in the north. So in this company's particular case, they were looking at how can we build a factory in the southern part, which is still north for, or relative much more north than I am. And so build them so that the majority gets done. They're stacked as efficiently as possible because of that transportation constraint, and then brought to micro factories, let's say, but they aren't micro factories at a specific job site. They're still factories in remote locate, or not remote location, but a central point. So it's kind of like a hub and spoke system. And then they would be able to fit out all the interior and exterior in those factories and then bring them to site for installation. So you're still creating jobs up north, which is uh, I won't go in the weeds, but there's a ISO standard for sustainability, and one of the factors that sometimes modular doesn't do as well in is in job creation, because the KPI is within like 100-kilometer radius. But if the factory is outside of that, then it doesn't do as well. So their goal was that they wanted to create jobs but build housing as affordable as possible. And in this case, it made more sense. Now, that was 4 or 5 years ago, and I don't think they've quite got off the ground with that model. They're still probably importing mostly from southern Canada, but that was kind of the goal, or what they're hoping to do.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And at this point, we'd like to welcome Craig Mitchell from Modular 720 to join us as our Q&A expert. So just a reminder to put your questions in the chat, and Brandon and I will make sure they're flagged for Craig. And Craig, I'll turn it over to you.
That's great. And thank you very much for the invite to, I guess, share some of my expertise over my 30-year career in modular construction. Just a little bit about me. I'm here in Vancouver. I've done projects across Canada during my career, and half my career was spent with a manufacturer out here in BC, and learned a lot, obviously, about the manufacturing side. But the last, I would say, almost a decade or so has been doing more complex multi-story, multi-family projects across Canada, especially in the last 5 years here with 720 Modular, where I'm a partner and also run our operations side of the business and a lot of our project development. So happy to entertain any questions here. And I know, Paige, you brought up some really good topics there at the beginning. And Brandon, I know you referred to a few things here we can discuss today just regarding some of the certifications and so forth. Just to be clear, I think one of the things which is an important differentiator when we talk about modular construction is there's really two aspects to the modular construction industry in Canada. And one is that we have single family residential modular housing, which is really, I'll call it quote unquote, more cookie cutter in terms of, a lot of owners will, choose one of 5 floor plans out of a catalog, and a modular factory can build that particular type of product, ship it to site. And that's often what Brandon referred to as that the manufacturing housing standards, A240, is sort of that stream of business. Most of my career has been spent on the other side of the business, which is more the A277 side of the business, which is, part 9, multi-story, multi-family, part 3 buildings, more complex buildings. Most of my experience has been in wood frames, so up to and including 6-story modular residential buildings in both commercial and industrial products, as well as in the residential side of the business, multi-story, multi-family. Especially as we get now, that being the big topic, of course, has been the Build Canada homes and trying to add scale to the housing inventory here in Canada. And you've probably seen a number of the notifications come out from Build Canada homes and the different programs that they're trying to embark on. So anyway, I just wanted to preface that in terms of where I think we'll focus a lot of the conversation here today is more on that, again, looking at scale. How do we build scalability into using offset construction methods? So with that, I'm happy to take some questions. And I guess maybe Brandon, I guess you did ask a question there just about, and I'll just clarify for A277 folks. And when we look at temporary versus permanent, I have done temporary modular buildings for the likes of BC Housing and other entities. There's some good examples on temporary affordable housing projects that then get relocated sometime in the future. And BC Housing's done fair number of those, as well as the city of Vancouver, over the last 10 or so years. And A277 does apply even on those temporary projects where they are, I'll call them more sort of those complex multi-story multifamily, where A277 would apply in those cases. So just FYI that standard does apply to those types of buildings. So
yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Craig. There was a question that came up, and I think I have the answer, but you're better to answer it than me. So just how is A277 ensure compliance with both provincial and national codes across the country? Just because there's so much variation. I understand it is that it makes reference to the local code that you're building in or the final destination of the module, but can you maybe elaborate on how
yeah, I mean,
CSA
again, CSA is a factory standard in that we assume the factory is building to that building code that is present in that particular jurisdiction they're building for. So, for example, often I will deal with factories across Canada that, you know, I'm shipping from one jurisdiction to the other. And, you know, good example, and I can show some examples today as we get into it. But for example, I'm currently working with a factory in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and I'm shipping modules from that factory to Ontario. It's always the end destination, so it has to meet Ontario building code. That factory has to build to that particular code. So it's really important that it's not the factory where the modules are being built, and it's actually the end site that we need to be aware of. So it needs to make sure that the factory is aware of the nuances in those provincial codes and the authority having jurisdiction. So really important. Then, you know, you bring up that topic of whether it is a modular integrator or the architect on the project who is ensuring code compliance, that that person or entity has that oversight and making sure that their certification is valid for that particular jurisdiction. So again, just something to be clear on.
Perfect. Thanks. Or do you go on and get started, Paige, or?
I was going to say, yeah, so we have some questions prepped. So we'll keep taking questions in the chat, but Brandon and I also have some questions off to the side here in the meantime. So what is the most commonly overlooked constraint during early site planning for modular projects, and how should teams address it before design begins?
That is a good question, and I encounter that many times in that I guess there's a couple of different aspects to site planning that we need to be aware of, and you know, a lot of it has to do around the logistics piece of the equation. And you know, I think Brandon mentioned some of the aspects around transportation and training. I would say those are the two most common constraints that we have around site planning, especially when we're starting to lift or crane modules or panels. Modules tend to be a little bit more restrictive. Obviously, you have, you know, volumetric modules that, you know, in the wood construction business, you may have a module that's, you know, say 12 feet wide and 60 feet long. It makes it very difficult in certain towns or cities, especially on infill projects where you don't have a lot of room, for example, on laydown spaces and accommodating large modules as such. So the first thing I usually do when someone gives me a site address, thank God for Google Maps, I usually go to Street View right away and just take a look at, okay, what trees are present, what overhead lines are present, what's my access routes like, and then I can get a pretty good feel. Often I will literally in the first 5 minutes of that conversation, either this is a candidate or not, even just on the logistics piece. And you can kill a project literally right off the bat by just looking at Google Street View. I've had a number of projects where client has gone to extreme lengths to design a modular building, and yet they forgot to look at the logistic piece. And I've had this happen, and especially in more urban jurisdictions where you know, infill projects where you've got narrow, mature streets with big trees, and you may only have access through a rear laneway, for example. You are not bringing a 60-foot module down a rear laneway with overhead power lines. I'm sorry, it's almost impossible. And so that would then shift that project, for example, from a volumetric module to maybe a panelized product, maybe more attuned to that type of form of construction. And I am starting to see that more and more as we start looking at as of right zoning into 4-plexes, 6-plexes, 8-plexes, especially in large cities such as Vancouver, Toronto, where we're Calgary, for example, where we're looking at infill projects where we're taking single-family homes and now building 6-plexes on mature streets. Volumetric modules may be very difficult to bring in those types of large offsite construction components, and those may be more of a candidate for panelized construction. So just to make everyone aware that that is definitely one of the things that are currently at play when we start looking at urban environments. So I think one of the other things I would say as well is that I guess commonly overlooked constraint, and this also thinks about our site planning or overall planning, as well as, I mentioned 12-foot by 60-foot modules. While that may not be, that may be the ideal size to maximize your factory considerations, maybe modules maybe need to be smaller to fit on a particular site. And, I've encountered that a number of times where instead of a 60-foot module, we'll have to almost, cut that module in half, and maybe it's a 25 or 30-foot module. And now we're creating 2 pieces on instead of just a single big module. And so again, site logistics and site planning is really one of the first key pieces that you really need to look at to optimize your offsite construction methodology.
Greg, when you're doing that, so I don't want to speak to specific projects, but at what point are you engaged as, let's say, as an integrator in your current hat? I know
Sure.
you're a manufacturer for a long time as well, but like at what stage are you engaged in is it pre-design? Is it sometimes even 720 would be hired before the architects? Where do they help in the procure, or what's kind of worked and what hasn't worked in your experience?
Yeah, often it's one of the first early engagements we'll get when an owner has an idea on a building project, and we will just provide some early analysis. Sometimes it's with the architect present in the room, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes owners, for example, nonprofits, I've got a few right now that have land, that they figure they can densify some of their existing land assemblies. And they just want a sanity check on, is this going to fit or not? And, with all this topic about, modular and offsite construction right now, there's a lot of focus on it, but a lot of people don't understand it. So that's where we come in, is that, sometimes we'll just provide, again, just that quick analysis, and it may be just a quick, like I said, a sanity check saying this is going to work, or maybe it's not, and then they can maybe start getting into some early design engagement after that. But you can pretty well figure out right away whether our project would make sense or it doesn't.
Okay, so our next question is, what misconceptions do municipalities still tend to have around volumetric modular or panelization, but modular more specifically, and what data or examples can help ease those concerns?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting landscape, having worked across Canada, and the familiarity of just some of the certifications in A277 specifically. I've encountered municipalities where building officials have a lot of experience with A277, and there's been a number of projects in a jurisdiction. And then I've encountered jurisdictions where they haven't done any, and there's a little bit of education required in terms of their inspection process. And so whatever situation I've encountered is that always find it's really good to engage the building department early on during the pre-construction phase to get a feel and understanding of what they want to see on site versus factory. Under A277, the authority having jurisdiction doesn't necessarily have a right to go to the factory. They are welcome to go to the factory and inspect, but typically most of the projects that I'm part of is that the factory A277 certification will override any municipal inspections for offsite components. A lot of the projects I'm working on also have the full discipline of consultants from architect, mechanical, electrical, and structural, and they will do field visits to the factory and factory reviews for those offsite components anyway. So there is an element, I want to say it's a doubling up of the inspection process, but it's actually a requirement under their licenses to make sure that they do their field reports during the different phases of construction. So again, getting back to the authorities having jurisdiction and sort of that feel for their education, I really find that early engagement and assessing how educated they are, or maybe if they need some education, there's plenty of documents out there from CSA that can provide some education to building officials to make sure they understand what where they have jurisdiction and where they do not. We try and always provide the authority having jurisdiction a delineation in what are the offsite components and what are the onsite components. For example, when you connect your modular structure and you bring it to site, all of a sudden now that's when the authority having jurisdiction will come into play. They will be responsible for reviewing all of the connection details and any of the on-site elements related to that modular building. So it's really crucial that no matter what you do from an engagement standpoint, is that there's a clear delineation for the building officials and the building inspector, that they know what they're facing when they step onto that construction site and what they're inspecting, and making sure that that is delineated upfront during the building permit phase, is that you're delineating that in your construction drawings. So that's just some assistance, I guess, provide that to anyone doing an offsite construction project.
I might jump in there, Craig. This is unrelated to the planning side, but on that note, I've heard examples of some trades when they're scoping out their work and pricing it, and there's some questions coming in on costs. So I'm kind of teeing it up for this, but I've heard a note like for electrical contractor here, they were quoting 6 or 7 modular projects, and they assumed, they arrive to site, they drill everything first week, then they chase all the wires, then they connect and so they assume that they're going to have their crews on site for 6 weeks, and then they get into it and it's 2 weeks, but they originally quoted 6 weeks and assumed that cost is a lump sum. And so naturally, costs should go down as the subtrades become more mature. But when you're speaking with the inspectors on like the delineation between on and offsite, are you also doing that and informing your subtrades and everyone ahead of time? Is it kind of using that same information to educate them and say, this is exactly what we need? Or are you just saying, provide a quote for a triplex or, whatever, which.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess a couple of comments around that, and just speaking sort of high level, that during my career, and more so, I would say 10 years ago, especially different jurisdictions, is that I would actually see projects get killed right off the starting block because the electrical and mechanical trades were overpricing the site work portion because they thought they had more work to do, and it killed the project budget. And so again, making sure that you do your homework up front and that you engage your electrical mechanical contractors up front during the pre-construction design development stage and really delineate that work package to make sure that they truly understand, what they're going to be faced with when they step on that construction site. And a perfect example is I was just in a meeting last week on a project I've got coming up in Collingwood, Ontario, and we sat down with the site contractors, all the different work packages, and delineating our progress drawings, just to make sure that what they quoted initially versus where we are now in further design development, that their pricing still stands. And to your point, Brandon, is that, really right now in this day and age in modular construction and offsite construction in Canada, I would say there is more education required, and we need better case studies of offsite construction projects, and really delineating where that dollar cost threshold is with electrical mechanical contractors, especially. We need to get better. I think they're still building in a little bit more risk into the projects because they're unfamiliar with that form of construction. And I think we really need to get better at, again, work packages and scope of work, and also training our design teams to really delineate, go that extra mile in showing what is on-site versus off-site work. I think that is definitely probably the next evolution as we get into this 3D modeling and of projects and how we can better send out scope of work packages just for those on-site, off-site elements. So.
One of the questions coming up in the chat is that while the whole idea of using modular is for acceleration, to build faster and maybe to build cheaper, it seems that the logistics and the requirements might increase the cost to an extent that volumetric modular might not be the best financially feasible method of construction compared to the flexibility of paneling or paneling. Also wondering if there is an impact on modular on employment, trades, trading in any given area.
Yeah, so let's maybe just address the first one there. From a logistics, transportation, craning perspective, that is a additional cost than that traditional construction does not have. So let's draw the line at, I guess baseline being traditional construction and that between modern methods of construction, offsite construction methods. When we look at that, often I see projects right now from traditional construction folks and they say, oh, modular construction is 10% higher, for example, just on straight off cost of construction methodology. And my argument back to them is, okay, you've got your transportation and your crane that traditional construction doesn't have. However, what sort of acceleration are you looking at in terms of your overall project schedule? And then, of course, your deficiencies and your turnover elements as well, and cost of financing. And so what, I'm seeing on most of our projects that we're doing, we're probably 30 to 40% faster than traditional construction on, say, what would be, say, an 18-month construction project, and now we can deliver in 12 to 14 months. What is that cost of financing as an offset, for example, against some of that hard construction costs? What are your general requirements? A general contractor is probably charging, $50,000 to say $100,000 per month in overall general requirements. And so what are those offsets? So we need to look at the whole value analysis of what offsite construction brings to the equation rather than just looking at hard construction dollars. And I think it's an important distinction when we start looking at projects and whether or not they pencil. And so I start there as the baseline that we really need to, I guess, educate the folks that are coming from the traditional construction world and starting to look at offsite construction as a methodology, because there are some definite advantages and cost equations that really need to be embedded into your overall pro forma. So that's number one. The other question I think you asked, Paige, was just more sort of training wise.
Yeah, the general training for the trades, GCs, and how does that impact employment, that kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. I think we're seeing this across Canada right now. There's all this talk of offsite construction methods, and really from a post-secondary trades training schools and so forth, we're not seeing that interest in offsite construction equate to trade and training programs currently. And I would say the only one that has really seen significant dollars toward trade training is really mass timber. I'm here in Vancouver, so for example, BCIT's got their own trade training program there for mass timber installation. And again, you have to think of, I guess, a lot of these post-secondary institutions, they're like businesses. They have to have a certain amount of critical mass before they start offering trade training programs. And I would say here in BC, we've got a lot of, it's the hotbed of mass timber here in BC. And so there's a lot of interest in that on the design front as well as on the construction front. And so that's why we're seeing trade training programs in that particular method of offsite construction. It hasn't equated yet to panelization and modularization at the moment. Do I think it'll get there? Yes. But right now it is I would say the learning curve is being taught through project delivery at the moment. And while that is not a great model and it's not scalable, I would say that it's still early days in panelization and modular construction where we will eventually see greater trade training. And what we are seeing is that construction companies are now setting up their own modular divisions, in that once they've done one or two projects, they now have a separate division within a lot of these construction companies where there is that built-in in-house expertise being acquired. And so I think that's the model that we'll see for a few years, is that a lot of the general contractors in that are setting up a particular team in-house to deliver those particular type of projects based on the skill set they've learned, and their trades as well. But I think we're still a ways yet from seeing, full scale, national sort of trade training programs.
Yeah. I will add too, Craig, just because it comes up a lot. I think I might have referenced it last week, but Buildforce Canada puts out their labor market forecast annually. And so the one that was released last March projects to 2034. And specifically for residential construction, they're forecasting a 52,000 worker need, which equates to just around 10%. The caveat with that is they're assuming that there's 120,000 new entrants, which a lot of that was coming from, that's before we got a bit tighter on our federal immigration policy and a few other things. So it'll be interesting to see how those forecasts come out. But sometimes it comes up, and I have many family members in the trades, and it comes up around job replacement. And so it's more like optimizing existing workforce for the demand that exists, I think, and turning that, like flipping that discussion around. And I mean, I know you've been in factories where there's some new automated stuff that it's ergonomically friendly, it's quicker, and so on, and it's from a quality control perspective much better as well. So we're starting to see that in the sector, and it's really like, how do we get the colleges, trade schools, universities engaged? And one last thing I'll say is, a few years ago, we talked to the province who determines what the curriculum for trade schools. I think, Craig, you were in the room when some of them were in the room in month and last September, and they were talking about their approach to updating curriculum. Well, when we talked to them, they kind of said, we train an automotive mechanic to be an automotive mechanic, not to work on, say, a Toyota versus a Ford versus a Mercedes. So their argument was like, we train a carpenter to be a carpenter, whether they're on a job site or in a factory. But more recently, we've had some discussions with them, realizing there's some nuances there, and it's not a direct comparator. So they, I think, will be looking at how can they embed that more into their colleges as well. So, which is good news.
Yeah, I think further comment on that too. I think really the conversation needs to be around productivity of the workforce. Ultimately, that's where the construction industry is currently struggling, is that we have seen declining productivity in construction over the last 25 years in Canada. And, we're among the worst performing nations in G20 on construction productivity. And so offsite construction is really I'll call it the shining star to increase our productivity in construction. And I think that's where we really need to focus some of our energy on that methodology. So.
Thank you. We have another question from the chat. Is there sufficient capacity within the MMC sector now, as it currently stands, to meet BCH's targets for affordable housing? And what constraints do you see within the sector?
Well, I guess this is very, very timely, because I was in a factory just last week, again in Fredericton, and going through their factory, and we talk about, Build Canada Homes and capacity. And frankly, right now, Build Canada Homes hasn't built or let any contracts for offsite construction right now. So when someone asked me about capacity, I said, until you start letting contracts, there's plenty of capacity right now. And I would say the manufacturing sectors across Canada, both in panelized and modular and modular construction are both waiting for Build Canada Homes to start producing. And so I truly believe that there is enough capacity based on what Build Canada Homes wants to do currently at play in Canada right now. Where I think the issue comes in is when we are in political circles and we talk about 500,000 homes needed to restore affordability in Canada. That's a different conversation. Let's just get contracts let and out the door, and the capacity issue, I believe, will solve itself based on that long-term pipeline of demand that is going to be required in this sector. I think it's really important that this is maybe just, again, this is my view and may not be others, but is that Build Canada Homes needs to look at this not as just a single one-off program that is political for the next 4 or 5 years. We need to be building pipeline and demand for housing in this country for the next 15, 20 years, maybe leveraging Build Canada Homes as a platform and using a platform approach to building homes so that we can get up there and, we'll use offsite construction for 200, 300,000 homes per year. But I really believe that, we're a long ways from that. And I think the existing manufacturers across Canada right now have more than enough capacity to deal with the initial demand of what Build Canada Homes is going to build. So let's just start. And again, there is going to be investment coming into that sector, which will add capacity to the sector once the program rolls out. So those are just my thoughts.
Amazing. And then maybe just as a follow-up to that on the capacity of general contractors and integrators who actually have the experience and knowledge to lead MMC projects.
Yeah. Paige, can I just follow up on what Craig was mentioning?
Sure.
I was just wondering, we are all talking about increasing number of units. So it will be, I think there is capacity. I trust you that saying that capacity there to do it, but it brings us back about cost per feet square. Because when we look at, I think it would be much helpful to have evidence-based kind of study or research, just like how much would it cost 500 to build 500 units if we build it not only conventional, all modular, all whatever. It can be a combination. It depends on the maybe communities. It depends on the local circumstances. But we need to look at it as a package because it's not only delivering cubes. It's merely like building intentional homes for, different kind of affordable, supportive housing and what maybe fit one does not fit the other. Just like we have been reflecting now on our building that we are running as high support, sometimes modular and the finishes and it just cost us also on the operational side higher. So maybe yes, instant cost or capital cost is cheaper because we are saving on time, and I don't see this. So if there is a formula saying how much time you're saving, like you mentioned conventional as 18 to 24 months, and sometimes I know that some projects when you have many units, it can take 4 to 5 years to build, right? So if through modular, first, can modular do that amount of units? Can modular do 11 and 12 floors? That is also another question. Maybe paneling system, yes. So how can we have a hybrid that is taking the best advantage of conventional freestanding structural system and then you use paneling maybe? So we take advantage of units have been produced on factory while the structure is just going the conventional way, freestanding structure on site. And then we marry the two and then get the best out of both concepts. Other than just promoting volumetric modular, just for one aspect, which I agree that is marvelous, controlled, whatever you have been saying since morning, but there is some drawback there. There is limitation to the number of floors, for example. There is also adding to the dead load of the building because you have to put, units on top of units. There is licensing, there is certification that all cost money. So end of the day, if we have say, however much billions, how much does it, how many units can be produced through modular versus the number of units that can be produced through the conventional type or any kind of hybrid. But end of the day, we achieve the target that becomes a moving target of maybe adding whatever number of units. And the supply, not only cheaper, but I'm just looking at like the homelessness is increasing very fast. So we need to also produce with the same rate or even more to be able to end homelessness. So I sometimes I feel like yes, we might have it having it cheaper or faster, but maybe conventional ways when we do economy of scale, we can produce in 3 years 100 units better for me than in 1 year only 25 units. So it becomes like it's just a matrix. It's not just like one way of looking at it, but it's a matrix including employment and training and through recession and creating, it's just like the social impact, the economic impact, and also the
Iman,
yeah.
sorry,
Thank you. Sorry.
I feel like what you're looking for is more of the data behind where the sector is currently, and maybe Brandon and Craig, you can talk a little bit to where we can find some of that data. I know that there have been papers published on that type of thing, Brandon, at the University of New Brunswick. I'm sure you probably have lots of reports on this type of thing. So maybe that's where we can maybe share some of that documentation or where to find that documentation in the chat.
Yeah.
And then
Thanks,
I'll let
Kate.
Craig address
Mm.
any of the other comments that you made that he wants to address, and then we'll turn it back over to that capacity question.
Yeah, thanks, Paige, and yeah, thanks for the comments there, Eman. And I think right now, as we stand here in Canada, from a capacity standpoint, you can look around the world at some really good examples of scalable solutions, and for example, the UK and Singapore are building 56, 60-story buildings using modular construction. They're maybe using it in steel or concrete. That technology doesn't necessarily exist here today. There are some steel solutions out there that are being developed right now that will address the Canadian market. And there are also other offshore entities right now looking at Canada to supply product here. $25 billion announcement, on the world stage makes people take notice. And so you're going to start seeing other offshore fabricated elements come onshore here in Canada. And I've been contacted by a number of them who are looking at this market, both in panelized construction as volumetric modular construction methods, that it is scalable and can address some of those productivity questions. I don't think we can solely say that this is a made in Canada solution that we're looking for here, that it is going to be a combination of other elements from around the world that may come into Canada. They will have to meet the certification processes, of course, but there are other entities looking at that currently. And I think toward, Paige, you bring up a good point about, data and metrics. I've always been an advocate, and I think Brandon will share this view too. We've had many conversations over coffee and probably a few beers talking about how do we get better data in this country to determine how best to deploy these offsite construction methods. And I think it should be one of the goals of Build Canada Homes that for any public dollars that are issued is that there should be a carrot, or maybe it's a stick, saying that if you're going to build an offsite project and we're going to give you dollars for it, you better collect the data on that project before we give you the dollars. And I think that is something I've been a strong advocate for, is that we need to collect that through any kind of public funded projects, because right now the data isn't there and we need better data. So that's all I'll say about that.
Yeah, I'll just add, Iman,
Thank
there is some studies that I can drop in the chat that make reference to certain things. I know, like that you mentioned price per square foot in a comment there as well, and that I know that's this trade-off in talking to some of the housing providers in our region is like, okay, if that's the added cost currently of volumetric outweigh the speed, because the if you're trying to reduce homelessness, you want people there as quick as possible, but there's also a cap on your budget that you're able to spend. So are you willing to spend a bit more to get them in faster? And so there's some research on like those trade-offs. I think one thing that we've seen is that when you go beyond the capital, and I mean, Craig, I think 720 might have a case study that showed, the cost overruns of the on-site scope versus the off-site scope for one of the projects. I remember seeing one. I might have used that data before
Yeah.
in a presentation. So I guess what I'm getting to is when you're looking at the cost matrix, so you have to look at all the kind of life cycle costs um, associated with that. And then when you're thinking, Amon, about operations and their O&M costs, there's a lot of uh, yeah, there's been some research done to show that it doesn't reduce. And like I haven't, maybe Craig, I haven't seen any like any modular done in passive house. I've seen some panelized done that way, precast concrete for sure as well. But there's been several modular projects that show that, like, from a building envelope and energy efficiency and so on and so forth, it's not an issue, and sometimes it's even stronger from an acoustic side. Sometimes it's stronger, which has come up potential for like supportive housing and different things as that like that as well.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've done a couple of multi-story, multi-family passive house projects during my career, and generally speaking, paying attention to the details in the factory is a lot easier, especially with building envelope and penetration through the wall. You get a far better metrics when it comes to air testing and blower door testing, for example, that tend to far surpass what you would do on site. So as long as you follow the details and the detailing in the factory, yes. And Brandon, just touching on your comment there about sort of that issue of potential cost overruns and change orders on projects. You have a lot more control out of a factory than you do on your site elements. That is just standard, just construction methodology. And good example was, we did a project. It was in PEI. It was one of our first projects, 4-story building, 28 unit affordable housing project. And everyone knows what happened during COVID, during price escalation on construction and labor, went up probably about 30% over the course of a 2-year, 3-year period there. We had less than 1% of overall construction cost change orders on the factory portion, which made up 75% of the overall project cost. And we had 28% change orders or escalation on our site elements, everything from excavation right through to electrical components that were required on site, transformers, and everything through to finishing site paving. And so if you can control a lot of your project costs, I always say it's easier to move that to offsite construction, because you'll know what your cost center is, because you're locking in your factory and your decision making so much earlier in the design process that it really takes that off the table when it comes to your site construction piece. So
I'll just point out a couple things happening in the chat before we ask our next questions. So first thing, just if you're not reading the chat, make sure to take a look at the chat, everyone. There are some great resources being shared there and lots of great conversation around different work that people are doing and reaching out for other conversations. So just make sure you're taking a moment to read the chat. And then just also remind around the data and expectation, just a reminder that UTL let us know that they are going to be publishing a white paper within the next couple of months for a lot of the work that they did around the housing supply challenge and their experiences with using volumetric and different for their projects, and how that specifically impacted both the costs of the project versus, but also how it impacted them as a student housing provider. So I feel like that's going to answer a lot of the questions that people are bringing up today that we might not have specific numbers on, but might be helpful. So if you're, last week UTL gave us the invitation to watch out on their LinkedIn for that, so just reiterating that. So sorry about that, Craig. Just wanted to make sure that people were aware of that information. So I'll go ahead and ask another question from our list here. I think I've addressed all the questions that have come up in the chat. So if I have not, if someone can just repost it at the bottom of the chat, I will make sure to get back to it again. But from your perspective, are there any design decisions that could be made that would have the biggest impact on the long-term durability or efficiency of operations as it relates to using a modern method of construction?
That one is actually fairly easy. Number one, get the operator at the table early. Often what I have found is that sometimes we get projects, especially if they're, say, municipal projects or county projects, and the operator is not at the table. All of a sudden, they only get involved maybe toward the end of the project, and now they're expected to run a building that you have just spent months and months designing and constructing, and yet it may not work for their operation or what they're used to. And so I always say, if there's an opportunity to get the operator at the table early on during the pre-construction phase and during the design development, then we can embed a lot of those use cases and how they work into the overall building architecture. And that goes down to, how familiar are they on mechanical and electrical systems, maintenance systems, and things like that, where we often find that sometimes they come in too late to the equation, and now they've got this complicated mechanical system that you need a PhD to run, and all of a sudden they just don't have that expertise on staff, and now they're hiring third-party consultants or contractors to manage their mechanical system, or that's just a good example. So I would say if there's an opportunity, especially when it comes down to the overall design development, if operations is important, if it's energy efficiency, for example, things surrounding accessibility. I know that CMHC has certain guidelines around number of units for accessibility, but maybe that doesn't serve the long-term impact of an operator. Maybe they need universal design throughout the building. And so, again, things to look at when you start that design development phase is that they should be there at the table right from the get-go. So that's my experience on that side.
Well, as someone who oftentimes represents the operator, kudos. I like this answer a lot because I definitely agree. It becomes a lot more difficult to hand a project off to an organization than it is to have them integrated from the get-go. Oftentimes these operators really know their tenants best. They know if there are design decisions that are being made that won't serve the tenants that they are planning to serve. And so there's definitely going to be impacts that can be avoided at early stage design discussion that these operators will have influence over.
One item I might actually add, and it goes toward just some of the nonprofits as well, and you bring up a good point, is that I've done a couple of projects now with Canadian Mental Health Association, and through the first project we did, we identified a lot of standardization. They didn't have a operations manual per se, and so really through that first building, we were able to develop one and standardize a lot of the equipment and floor plans that allowed for them to scale their second project. We cut the design schedule by 30% on the second project they did. And again, now that they've got standardization in their project floor plans, their next project that they'll do will go even faster. And so I think, we can develop, again, the consultant team, the architect, and the integrator can really develop standardization throughout some of these nonprofits where maybe they don't have that expertise, and really can help them throughout developing future projects. So
great answer. We do have one more question in the chat, and I think this will probably be our last question before I turn it over to Brandon to close this out for the day. But have you seen any instances where coordination issues are identified on the factory floor? Would there be costs incurred due to the pause in production? If this occurred, are there any penalties involved, or is this just really rare?
So is it rare? Yes. That is only, I would make the caveat there that if you've done your pre-construction work flawlessly, you shouldn't have any production delays on the factory floor. And now I'm talking in a perfect sense. I have seen that happen. I've been on projects during my manufacturing career where we told owners that they wanted to make a change when all the design was done and they wanted and all the procurement was done and we'd already started on the factory floor and they wanted to make a change on this one detail on a total of, I think it was 100 plus modules, and they wanted the same change done 100 times. And we said, stop, that change is going to cost you $17,000 an hour because you've got 150 employees standing with their hands in their pockets while you make that change. So I think that's a pretty good deterrent for most owners to do their homework up front and make sure that your pre-construction is bulletproof so that you're not making changes on the factory floor. So I would say that, again, it's really critical that you sign off that this is what you're building in advance of going into full production. One other item I might add is that maybe you take your first module in production and make it a prototype so that everyone can touch it, feel it, take a look at it. Is this what you want before we do this 100 more times? And that I find is often a good methodology, is that you treat your first module on your production as the prototype that everyone can come in and make sure that everything is certain before you start producing the rest of your entire production. So
amazing. That's great. Thank you very much, Craig, for your time today. We really appreciate you joining us. At this point in time, I'll turn it back over to Brandon to close out our day and let everybody know what is happening next week.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, just to add, Craig, on that last one, I've seen a lot of the design teams internally run through like some pretty advanced BIM software and that is to avoid that. But I mean, the example you threw out is a larger project. A lot of the times where I've seen it happen, it's on like maybe single family or smaller multifamily, and it does impact production, but I don't think like it can be as simple as all of a sudden they want to move a closet a little bit or whatnot. And I haven't heard of them going back and it significantly impacting cost overall, but it does temporarily impact production. In most cases, they do what you say. This is a consequence of that change. All right, so thanks everyone. That was great. So for next week, the topic that we're talking about is time and money, financing, scheduling, and managing MMC projects. So we're going to look at cost structures, financing impacts, and unique MMC sequencing, contracting requirements, monitoring and site visit protocols for factory-based construction, replicability for standardization and portfolio-wide efficiencies, and supply chain realities, so Canadian manufacturing capacity, lead times, and regional constraints. So with that, I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Craig for sticking on for the full time as well. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.